Thank you so much for asking me to talk. If I make it through this without crying, it will be a small miracle, so wish me luck. So yes, I am on faculty here in emergency medicine, and I'm a toxicologist. And I also, for the last 3 years, have been a reader and a small group facilitator for the narrative medicine and reflective practice here. That may have just given a few students like a little bit of a oh in the gut because they know I've been reading their essays for the last 3 years. But you know, I think nothing makes it more clear to me how important reflective practice and narrative medicine are than talking about gun violence. You know, luckily we don't have comparatively much gun violence here in Portland. Most of the patients I've seen in the 7 years I've been here have been very few and far between. They've been accidental discharges and, you know, some, you know, really sad cases of self-harm, but that wasn't the case in St. Louis, Missouri, where I went for medical school, nor was it the case in Chicago, where I did my residency. For reference, East St. Louis and St. Louis, two adjacent cities, are currently the #1 and #4 cities on the list of highest per capita murder rates. You know, Chicago's reputation as a very violent place with a lot of gang violence is certainly well known, and while my residency was in downtown Chicago, we spent 2 months rotating at the Cook County Trauma Center, which is what the TV show ER was based on. It's a huge hospital that has a dedicated trauma unit that serves South Chicago, which is where a lot of the gang violence is. So my goal here today is that I want to share with you my own stories and stories from some colleagues of how they have suffered from working alongside and, you know, repeatedly treating patients who've suffered from gun violence. I in no way want to detract from the victims themselves or take any focus off of communities that are ravaged by violence like I saw in Chicago. It's more that when we're standing here, a bunch of healthcare providers together talking about this, I think it's so important for us to acknowledge, you know, the things that we see and how badly they hurt us too, and then take those feelings and help mobilize by sharing our experiences with the world. So, in preparation for this talk, I sent out a plea to my network, asking people to just send me, you know, what thoughts they had from like the case that haunted them or the worst thing they saw. And immediately recurring themes came up. One of my co-residents, Sarah, wrote me about a 12-year-old boy she had treated. This was in Chicago. He apparently wanted to play outside and was running down the street shouting for his older brothers down the block. There was a gang nearby that heard the shouting and mistook it for something else and ended up opening fire, and this child caught a stray bullet. In her email, Sarah stated that she will never forget his rosy cheeks and this little boy looking at his mother saying how scared he was right before she intubated him. And she reported he then went on to die. He did not last the night. An OBGYN I know who works in Los Angeles at a county hospital described to me what she called the single most traumatic case of her career, where she was called to the emergency department to help with a 31 weeks pregnant woman who had been shot 26 times. Apparently the father of her baby was in a gang, and a rival gang had tracked her down and shot her. She being the OBGYN who shared the story with me, performed a crash C-section in the emergency department, which is something that, you know, emergency physicians and OBs train for and essentially never do. She did this crash C-section to deliver a baby that was expected to be dead already. At this point, they were delivering basically a dead baby to try and save the mother. And then Leah went on to the operating room with the trauma team, and she said that she sat there trying to sew up holes in this woman's uterus while the trauma team removed her spleen, most of her pancreas, one of her kidneys, and several segments of bowel. While this patient did survive, Leah said she has continued to have nightmares 2 years later, intermittently thinking about the patient. One of my co-residents, Julie, told me that there was this phenomenon we would call drop-offs that happened sometimes in residency, where people would just roll up to the hospital and dump their nearly lifeless friend on the street and take off. We'd scoop these patients up, take them into the trauma bays, and do our best to save them, and more often than not, they couldn't be saved. We didn't have names, we didn't know who to call. Julie talks about how when things like that would happen, several days later she would be going about her life and have intrusive thoughts of dead bodies lying on the ground. And speaking of intrusive thoughts, there is nothing that no words I think that I can call up to describe for you the sound of a mother who has just been told that her child is dead. This sort of guttural howl and the sound of knees hitting the ground and people sobbing. I can tell you that myself, 2-ish years ago, as a new parent struggling with postpartum anxiety and depression, had all the normal versions of things that parents worry about with their children coming to harm, but I have a horrible recurring soundtrack and visual of what it looks like to see a parent lose their child suddenly, and those are the images that would come into my mind. Intrusive thoughts, nightmares. This is the language of PTSD. This is what providers, struggle with when we see and care for these patients who we want so badly to help. I have sat in the middle of the Cook County Trauma front room, nervously caring for members of opposing gangs. There was one night, over about a 90-minute period, that somewhere nearby there was an active shootout taking place, and someone would fall, they would come to our hospital, and 10 minutes later they would bring the next victim. And the way that Cook County was set up in this giant room where all traumas come in, and there's no privacy, we were doing our best to keep members of one gang on one side of the room and one gang on the other side of the room. And, I learned that gang members sort of seem to have some kind of code they follow where they don't inflict harm inside the hospital. But I sat there trying to help all of these people who had been shot as they paced around the room glaring at each other, making calls and giving names to their colleagues to send in more victims. I once had to hide under a table at Cook County when a security guard came running into our room and said there was somebody with a gun in a hallway. I have an attending in residency who got punched in the face after telling somebody that their child had died from gun violence. I have another colleague who worked at a level 1 trauma center in Houston who describes a time where a patient suddenly lunged out of nowhere and grabbed a security guard's gun and had essentially managed to brandish it when another resident who happened to be a rugby player was walking by and tackled her. I am by no means trying to imply that we as providers are less safe than people who live with this violence every day. I'm more trying to illustrate that we have snapshots into how unsafe people can feel every day of their lives, and that we still have to find a way to put that aside and come to work and trust that things are going to be okay. Trust that, as my friend Julie shared the story of a patient who had come in police custody, handcuffed, somehow, no one knows how, managed to get a gun into their hospital room and stash it underneath a bed on the gurney. It was found by a cleaning service when he was out of the room. It was loaded and the safety wasn't on. Anybody could have found this gun sitting in the middle of the ER. We are secondary victims of this violence, and we have to figure out how to process the emotional and psychological fallout on ourselves. So I want to take just a short moment, sort of the rest of my time, to talk about death notifications. There are classes in medical school that teach you this, proper way to approach how to break bad news. I did them too, and it's a worthwhile process, but nothing in class can prepare you for what it feels like to know ahead of time that you're about to ruin someone's life. And nothing in a class can prepare you for managing your own feelings if you've just experienced something horrible and traumatic, and then trying to put that aside to be there for another family. I have a few examples I want to share. A social worker who works here sent me an essay she had written, and this was just a small portion of it that I thought was very powerful. She was talking about, calling families and having people come into the hospital, and how you can't always share all the information over the phone, both because things that you know to be true maybe haven't been confirmed by police yet, and also because you need people to get to the hospital safely. She said, You know how people's lives will shift before they know it. Like a time when I knew a family would be taking care of their loved one's infant with no warning and no preparation. Because I already knew that the infant's mother was dead on scene and that the father was in the ICU. I knew all of this, but I couldn't tell them over the phone because I couldn't confirm it. I wasn't the one on the scene, but I knew. So instead, I started gathering baby necessities around the hospital. They won't have diapers, clothes, receiving blankets, or shampoo. I had one experience, well, two experiences with death notifications that I want to share with you all. One of which I replay every single time I give a death notification now. There was a family in Chicago that the story was sort of parents in their 60s with adult children were going through a very bitter divorce. And I guess the mother owned a building that the father lived in, and she sent her two adult sons over to break the news to the father that it was time for him to move out. And I don't know what circumstances went wrong, but in the moment the father grabbed a gun and shot both of his sons and then turned the gun on himself. So one of the sons and the father were dead on the scene. The other son, who was shot in the face, was still alive and was transported to my hospital. As a provider, I think few things for me are harder to process than when you see significant facial trauma. It's like you look at a person and you feel like you're seeing them become not a person when their face doesn't look normal. This man's face was gone. And we did the best we could to stabilize him in the emergency room with the plan to take him to the trauma bay to the trauma OR to at least stabilize him to possibly pursue organ donation, but we weren't able to get him out of the room, and he ended up expiring. I was a senior resident and offered to do the death notification, and I was so filled with emotion from what I had seen and from the story that I'd heard. I did the best I could to try and break the news to this man's wife, the woman in her, I'd say, mid-40s, and their two teenage kids. And all the classes I'd taken, all the practice I'd done, I did a terrible job. I blurted it out. I said wrong things. I had a wavering voice. I could barely keep it together myself, and then I sat and watched this family process this horrible grief and felt so much guilt that I had somehow made this process worse for them. I replay this every time I now have to give a death notification, just a quick in my brain reminder of how traumatizing it can be for us too. There's one other just really sad case. This is probably the saddest one I think I've seen that will always haunt me, and I want to share this and then kind of wrap up. There was another night at Cook County, a very busy day. I think we had 27 gunshot victims come in a 24-hour period, which to them they would say moderately busy. This was not a gang member. This was a man who worked at a car wash, and apparently somebody was not happy with the job that he did and left the car wash and then came back with a gun and shot this man in the stomach. And he came in and we were doing our trauma assessment. It was clear he was very sick. All the signs of shock were present. And, he didn't speak great English. He was likely undocumented. I happened to be standing next to the bed, and he reached out and grabbed my arm and said, "I'm going to die." I looked at him, sheet white, sweat beating up on his upper lip, his pupils 10 millimeters and dilated in a brightly lit room, and I thought to myself, yes, you are. And I looked him in the eye and said, "You're going to be fine. We will help you." And as he wheeled out to go to the operating room, I sat there feeling so guilty, knowing I had lied to him and knowing that he was absolutely not going to survive. I wish the story ended there, and I wish it ended with this memory of this man looking me in the eye, telling me he was going to die. But actually, about an hour later, the secretary came over to me and said, "Did anybody ever speak with the family of the gentleman who was shot in the stomach?" And it was at that moment that I realized his wife and 2 children had shown up to the hospital and been so scared, and maybe I'm projecting, but afraid of not speaking English well and not wanting to say or do the wrong thing. They hadn't really made a stink to let anyone know they were there. And I looked over and they're just standing in the doorway waiting. I called the trauma surgeon and asked for status, and she told me that they were basically about to pronounce the patient dead in the operating room. And she walked out and said, "Don't worry, I'll do it." The relief that I felt from not having to talk to this family was palpable, and also made me feel so guilty. But I watched this trauma surgeon walk away with her head hanging low, and in this sort of cinematic moment saw this family captured. This mother, these 2 young children just waiting to hear the worst news of their lives from their father and husband, who was at work washing cars and got shot for doing a bad job. He is not a gang member. The family that was where the father shot 2 sons and himself, they were not gang members. The reason I am highlighting that is I think that so often people lose sight of the fact that this does impact everybody. This is not about a few communities. I want to end by reading you, I think, a very beautifully written little short blurb I received from one of our residents here. And it seems fitting since today is the anniversary of the Columbine shooting. Dr. Skog wrote this. He said, "On December 14th, 2012, I was an eager medical student in shock trauma hospital in Baltimore, Maryland. I was working a 24-hour shift, and that afternoon the stories started pouring in how the whole nation was reeling from the terror that occurred at Sandy Hook. As the afternoon and evening progressed, the trauma patients started to roll in, as was normally the case. Some ground-level falls, some car accidents, some assaults, and some gunshot wounds. It was a typical Friday night at shock trauma, and as my shift came to an end at 7 a.m. on Saturday morning, I counted a total of 17 patients who were gunshot wound victims in Baltimore that night. As I left the hospital bleary-eyed and in somewhat of a daze, I couldn't help but think how there were no camera crews in front of the hospital, no journalists, no one asking questions about all of the shootings the night before. Sandy Hook was a special type of horribly monstrous act, but the fact that these mass shootings are what comes to people's minds when they think of gun violence in America means that there's a huge underappreciation for the total toll that guns inflict upon individuals, families, and communities. Healthcare workers, particularly in emergency departments around the country, are cursed with an insider's view of just how common gun violence is and the pain it inflicts on families in certain communities. While certain people will be violent with or without guns, the degree of destruction that guns allow a small minority of people to inflict on communities is something we must stop. So we are people of privilege. We are physicians and nurses and social workers, and we have voices. And we see things that other people who are well-meaning people of privilege who want to help, they don't see. It is important for us to reflect on these experiences and share these stories, both to help ourselves deal with the PTSD that comes from being alongside it, and also so that the rest of the world will know about it and what it really looks like. And that's it. Thanks.